So this morning, we have a theme that is basically from Jeremiah, trust in the Lord. Trust that as things are unfolding in the world, we are following the words of the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done. Often that isn't what we really want and see, though. We want to actually trust in the things that this world tells us to trust in. To trust that our government has our backs, that being militarily strong is going to keep us safe, that basically the thing I trust in is that idol of control. I believe that I can control things because I have organized it or because I have told people what the plan is. You know, if it's on the calendar on a particular day or date, that by goodness, that is what's going to happen. Or if I tell the family that we are going to do something for a holiday, there is no way that anybody's going to wake up grumpy or have a cold or not be able to catch a flight or something else will go on, right? Like, I just sort of think things will unfold the way I have managed them. And that isn't life, right? We know that there are times when we get the surprise, when we get unexpected thing that happens that shows us that maybe we don't quite have the control that we think that we have. And that can be hard. That's when it causes us to have to rely on our faith. And I think that that's what Jeremiah is referencing when he talks about trees with deep roots, right? We have to dig down deep sometimes and have a faith that's so solid and strong and sure that unlike a shrub that's just sort of on the surface, when we weather the hard times, we can stand steady, that we know that we can count on some truths about God, which is that God is with us, that God loves us, and that God calls us very good. Those things were guaranteed. Sadly, we're not guaranteed that our prayers will be answered in exactly the ways that we want them to be. Right? Or that life will unfold, events will unfold, the world will look exactly as we want it to be. And yet God is in all of it. And I think that that is where we have to simply rely on our faith, on the belief that Jesus Christ really is here. That just like Paul told us in Corinthians, which is kind of a challenging reading, that we know that Christ is risen because Christ is in each one of us. Know that Christ lives because we live. We know that God is in the world because we are in the world, and we are bearing that. We are the Christ bearers in some ways. Now, well, we are in all ways now before Christ returns. And so that can be a challenging thing to live into. Like, how do we promise to live into this idea that we are Christ and everyone else is Christ as well? And we hear from Luke today in the 6th chapter what's known as the Sermon on the Plain. Like in Matthew, we have the Sermon on the Mount, where he's on the mountaintop and it's the Beatitudes. And it's really easy to compare those two sermons because they both talk about blessings, right? All of the things. This one, though, is a bit different because it also talks about the woes, the things that are harder in a more direct way than some of Matthew's. You know, Matthew talks about blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke says blessed are the poor, like the people who are hungry, the people who are struggling. They're blessed. And it can be confusing because that doesn't seem like a blessing to us. And what I think Jesus was trying to point out once again is God's message is countercultural. Like, we look at someone and think, it is not a blessing to be suffering. It is not a blessing to have hard times. It is not a blessing to struggle. And I'm aware in my own life that in my times of struggle, in my times of suffering, in my times of really not being able to manage the world like I think that I should be able to, that's when I begin to rely on God. That's when I show up and have the humility to welcome the help and support of others. That's when I recognize that God's in it with me, even if it's not unfolding exactly as I want it to. Even if, the prayers that I'm asking are not showing up in the way I expected, God's hearing those prayers. And I'm ready to be more open to what does appear than when I have kind of a less humility. When things are going well, it's easy to sort of forget. Like, it still all belongs to God. It's still all trying to show up and be faithful. If things are going along well, it's easy to think, wow, I'm doing such good things. I'm in God's favor. It's all unfolding according to plan. But if that's what I believe, then anyone who's struggling, God has a problem with them. And I don't think that that's true, right? God loves all of us. Life is the struggle. This world is what's hard. Even Jesus experienced that, for goodness sakes. I mean, if anyone should have had like smooth sailing, easy time, it would have been Jesus, right? And Jesus suffered and struggled. He knew what it was like to be deemed a false prophet and people speaking unkind things to him. He got it. And so one of the things as I was reading this week was there was a commentary that talked about that the Hebrew for woe, that word the root comes from kind of two ways, and one of it can be woe, like woe, stop, woe, horse, woe, pay attention. Like, so stop and notice, which prophets often say. The other, though, is woe, like yikes. Yikes, uh-oh, what's happening? And I think some of these woes are like, uh-oh, like the people who are laughing today should not be too proud of like how good life is for them, because guess what? Tomorrow might be a totally different day. The people who have plenty, don't be too, think it's all about you, because uh-oh, next thing you know, you might not have what you need. Don't think that because everybody is saying your name is the greatest thing since sliced bread, uh-oh, you suddenly made someone mad and you're kind of on the outs. And so really having the understanding that as we navigate the world, it's the both and. It's the both the blessing and the uh-oh. It's the joy and the sorrow. It's the hungry and it's the filled. It's all the things. And so remembering that not just for myself, but for others, for communities, for all of us as we move through the world is such a good way of remembering. The other thing is, I think when we hear these blessings, again, we think more of the Beatitudes and all of that, and the way Matthew presented them. We should keep in mind that the people who are hearing this story are coming from Luke's perspective. And so when they hear things about blessing and Beatitudes, they're not thinking probably of Matthew and his Sermon on the Mount. They're thinking of what they've just heard in chapters. Well, they didn't know it was chapters because it's a story, but chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. They're thinking of Mary, and blessed is she, right? They're thinking of Elizabeth, whose baby leapt in her womb when Mary appeared. They're thinking of Zechariah, who talked about how blessed he was after being struck mute for such a long time until they presented John at the temple. They're thinking of Simeon, who spoke of how blessed he was to have finally seen the Messiah. They're thinking of Anna, who felt so blessed that she went out and proclaimed the good news that the Messiah has been born. They're thinking of the blessings of these people and how God has appeared and shown up to them in very real and true ways. And there was some suffering, right? Like Mary's yes came with a lot. Unwed mother, probably about 14 years old, who was going to see her son killed, murdered by the powers that be. They're thinking of Zechariah, who could not speak for the remainder of his wife's pregnancy. I mean, being struck mute, that's pretty challenging. They're thinking of Elizabeth, whose son goes off into the wilderness, and they don't really have the kind of family life she probably had hoped for, right? And of Simeon, who longed to go to see the Lord and had to wait until the Messiah appeared. Again, all of these things, there's blessing and there's woe. There's yay and yikes in in all of it. And I think that that's what life has to offer us. One of the things that we did today at our annual meeting, and for which I am so grateful, is as a community, we adopted a communications covenant, the 10 rules of respect for how we are in relationship with one another. And I think it's really beautiful. You know, in the meeting, Reverend Nina pointed out, we are in covenant with God because of our baptismal vows and the ways that we are in relationship with God and each other, and our communications covenant does the same. I'm not going to read the covenant right now, but there are copies on the table in the Welcome Center, and they have been emailed. But what I want to point out is these rules for relationship are also countercultural. It goes against kind of how we tend to have conversations and how we deal with conflict. Most of us have not been taught in our homes how to disagree in loving, respectful ways. Usually people either are silent, or they blow up, or they just sort of wait for it to go away and then you just pretend it didn't happen, right? And none of these things actually lead to deeper relationship. Conflict actually is a gift of relationship, because if we didn't disagree and work through it, it means we don't really care. When we care, we're willing to be in conflict and try to resolve it, because that leads to a deeper level of relationship and intimacy and trust, which is what love's about. If there is no trust, there is no relationship. And so the big thing that we're going to be agreeing to, or we did agree to counterculturally, is when we have a problem, whether your problem is with me or someone else in the pews or a ministry group or whatever, we go directly to that person and we tell them what our concerns are and how we are struggling. I know I would always rather hear hard news face to face than to hear the whispers of it behind my back. I can't do anything about that. And that's the thing with conflict. If we are willing to have the courage to speak to one another about the ways in which we disagree, then we can lead into conversations which can be healing, which can lead to apology, which can lead to growth and even change sometimes. But at least we know where we stand. I love you enough that I'm going to tell you the problem that I have with you. I'm hoping you love me enough that we can talk through this together and find a new way of relationship. It doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but at least we're having that practice of the dignity and respect of every person, of recognizing God is in you and God is in me, and let's figure it out together. The other piece is, if you do not feel safe talking to the person with whom you have conflict, you can always have someone go with you. But we need to make sure that we're not just talking about our disagreements in private, that we're not talking directly to we need to be talking directly to the person with whom we are struggling, and we need to trust that God will be in that and in the good, healthy relationship that unfolds. You know, in Nadia Bolz-Weber's book, she talked about the idea that church is not perfect, it's practice. This is one of the ways that we at St. Luke's can be countercultural. We can practice having conflict and hard conversations with one another in respectful, courageous, loving ways. Because the more we practice it here, the easier it gets out in the world. And we know we can treat each other with the generosity of spirit and love that we are called to do. And so I'm really looking forward to this new season in our lives. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be smooth sailing and easy going. I do think that we will look back and think there are more blessings than woes.